Hey, everybody. Welcome. It's going to be a great conversation tonight. I'm going to be talking with Daniel Burke of the Schiller Institute. He's going to give us some insights onto recent events, Joe Biden's phone call that he just had with President Xi Jinping, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and the anti-Russian hysteria. We're going to talk about the great conference we just had and some of the reactions to the CPI conference. It's going to be great, everybody. So welcome. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Going to be a great show tonight. Be sure to tune in and spread the word.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right, so I'm here with my good friend Daniel Burke. Both of us just got back from Texas, where we had an amazing conference that just took place in Austin. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But I think Daniel wants to give us the latest about this meeting that took place, obviously over telecommunications between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. So what happened?
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Caleb. Basically, there was a conversation today. I invite everyone to read the Chinese readout in full. Of course, it's not very long. And in my view, it's a place that you should place some of your optimism. You should find some hope here, not because Joe Biden did something wonderful, that's not really the issue, but because you have a steady hand coming from the Chinese government, that's coming from Xi Jinping, simply sticking to reality, sticking to the actual crisis that we're dealing with in the world, and calling on the United States to change. And this, this is really the kind of hope that we should have in ourselves for changing the United States. Xi Jinping, he indicated really clearly that the sanctions could trigger, and I'll quote, serious crises in global economy, trade, finance, energy, food, and industrial and supply chains, crippling the already languishing world economy and causing irrevocable losses. So, there's a clear-eyed recognition that we are in an avalanche in potential in the breakdown of the neoliberal economic system through this kind of boomerang effect. That's what the Chinese are calling it, of the sanctions, that expelling Russia as much as possible, of course, seizing their central bank reserves, just like was done in Afghanistan. These actions have a consequence on upholding the bubble that is the Wall Street City of London system. And further, Xi Jinping said, "It takes two hands to clap." He's quoting Chinese sayings. He said, "He who tied the bell to the tiger must take it off," meaning that, as they've been saying through their foreign ministry, the United States has to acknowledge sincerely what's happened with the encroachment of NATO towards Russia's borders, and they need to shift. He ended, or the readout ends, with the following statement: "An enduring solution would be for major countries to respect each other, reject the Cold War mentality, refrain from bloc confrontation, and build step by step a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture for the region and the world." Which is, of course, where the Schiller Institute has placed our major focus, is what are the principles, what's the basis for this necessary new security architecture. So that's basically what I gathered from this readout.
Interesting. Now, at this point, China, they're not like fully on board with what Russia's doing. in Ukraine, but they have basically said that the blame for it is on the United States with the expansion of NATO. And I've seen some great videos from, like, Chinese students, expressing their solidarity with
Oh, yeah.
Russia, etc. And today at the UN Security Council, and I covered it for RT, there was a meeting that happened where Russia raised their concerns about these biolabs in Ukraine. And China echoed their concerns about these biolabs. And the United States said, oh, that's a crazy conspiracy theory, didn't even acknowledge what Russia was saying. And they're saying basically that these labs that have been built by the United States in Ukraine, apparently in coordination with the Pentagon, and they sound an awful lot like weapons labs, but the United States is denying that that's what they are. They could have a very big impact on public health, and we should be a little bit concerned about this, especially in light of a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And China echoed Russia's concerns. This sounds like a very serious matter. And the British, the United States, they were just so dismissive. I mean, it's like, if Russia says it, therefore it can't possibly be true. Russia can say the sky is blue, and they must be lying, because nothing Russia says can be taken seriously. I was kind of shocked at the tone of the meeting where Nebenzia is sitting there. He's like, I've got documents. We have letters from Pentagon officials showing these labs were set up. And I was a little bit disturbed. I saw that that not only are these concerns Russia's raising about these labs not being taken seriously, on television, Whoopi Goldberg has called for Tulsi Gabbard to be imprisoned just for talking about it. Mitt Romney wants the Department of Justice to investigate anyone who talks about it. I mean, this is shocking to me. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of these, QAnon Tea Party Republicans, she's been bold enough to talk about it. And I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, why are our leaders not, taking this at all seriously?
Well, I mean, there's a certain utopian kind of characteristic to the way these people think. So I do think that they believe their own lies, in the sense, the fundamental lie being, we can do whatever we want. Other people have to do what we say. We're in charge, right? And that has so clearly evaporated, and yet they're not able to change from their traditional mode of thinking in this regard. So it's extremely dangerous. I mean, it shows you that, like, the fundamental characteristic that is, in my view, necessary for us to get out of the crisis is the ability for people to change the way that they think. And what will cause these people to change the way that they think? I think the only thing part of it might have to do with an increasing recognition of who is causing the economic conditions in the United States, because they're relying on such a thin claim about how it's Putin that's causing this economic crisis. And I just, after so many years of Russiagate, after so many years of attacking anyone who had anything to say as a Russian bot, I just feel like this is very weak, and there is going to be an increasing pressure on our leadership, so-called, to address this.
Sure.
Without the lies about Putin.
Right. Now, one thing that you brought up is, it seems that Tucker Carlson and some other voices in American media have in mind, they're calling for some kind of wedge strategy. They think, well, if we can manipulate China against Russia, or Russia against China, that'll be a way that the United States can come out of this ahead or something. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I can point to a couple of cases. It is the case that anyone who sort of watches Tucker Carlson, he's an interesting guy because he gets certain things right in a particular way. He has been the leading media voice bringing people on who are contradicting the State Department lies about Russia and so forth. However, he's crazy on China. He's almost totally crazy on China. He's changed slightly since then. But then look at other even worse exponents of this, like Steve Bannon and his associates, Jack Posobiec, who basically have shown that they've publicly stated they're against NATO expansion. They're against blaming Putin for everything that's happening. But then they turn around and they've been working for decoupling with China for so many years. And then recently, I just saw yesterday, the New York Times put up a discussion with Fareed Zakaria of CNN, in which he again stated this outlook, that we can cause, that Russia's really not such a big deal, and that we can cause China to break from Russia. This is completely divorced from reality. The strategic partnership between Russia and China has been built over decades, particularly since Putin coming into power, and it is not going anywhere. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because I remember when Donald Trump was first running for president, and this was actually before Bill O'Reilly got, canceled. When Bill O'Reilly still had a show, Donald Trump was running for president. And one of his talking points against Obama in his interview, he said, "You can't have Russia and China together. You can't have Russia and China together." And Barack Obama has done that. He's gotten them together. We can't have that. And I saw that interview, and I actually ended up writing a very, an article about it, a very short article. But because, playing Russia and China against each other was a very successful strategy for the U.S. imperialists during the Cold War. They did a very good job of that, and that probably played a very, very big role in the defeat of the Soviet Union. But things have really changed, and the relationship between the two countries is not what it once was. So, the Soviet Union wins World War II. You have a wave of countries in Eastern Europe that are aligning with the Soviet Union. They call them people's democracies. In China, then you have a civil war because Chiang Kai-shek refuses to have a coalition government with Mao after the Second World War. He refuses a coalition government. He says, no communists in the government. Then he tries to tell Mao that he has to disarm the army that he fought Japan with. Mao says no. There's a civil war, and then eventually out of that civil war, you get the People's Republic of China. But at that point, China was still deeply, deeply poor. And, 1949, China, becomes a socialist country. But when China is developing, it's getting a lot of Soviet aid. The Soviet Union builds a lot of power plants in China. It builds like storm levees. It brings medical supplies. And China is kind of dependent on the Soviet Union during those years. And there's a feeling that the Soviet Union tried to assert political control over the Chinese Communist Party. And then, after Stalin's death, you had Khrushchev who came into power. And Khrushchev, 1956, he used his opportunity at the Communist Party Congress to just completely attack Stalin, accuse Stalin of every crime in humanity, say that basically everything that the U.S. media had alleged about Stalin was completely true. Some of the things that were said are so ridiculous, like that Stalin was hiding under his desk because, when the Nazis invaded, Stalin he was so scared and hiding under his desk. And that's ridiculous. Stalin was had been a bank robber at one point in his life. I mean, you think he was terrified of an army thousands of miles away or something. It's ridiculous. But regardless, so 1956, Khrushchev gives his secret speech. And for a moment, Mao seems like maybe he likes that. They have some de-Stalinization in China. But then ultimately in 1961, when Khrushchev says that he wants to negotiate with the United States, and that basically people in Africa and Latin America and different places who are engaging in armed communist revolutions, they have to call it off because the danger of nuclear war is too great. In response to that, Mao says, no, this is a break. He calls it revisionism and a break with true Marxism or whatever. And so China and the Soviet Union have a falling out. And the Soviet Union cut diplomatic ties with China, which is a really big deal. I mean, no ambassadors, nothing. And then that aid that China was dependent on from the Soviet Union was then cut off. And so in response to that, you had the Great Leap Forward. Mao said, well, we're going to prove we didn't need your aid after all. And we're going to try to be ultra communist. And we're going to have these super egalitarian reforms. And we're going to, speed ahead without your aid. And that obviously didn't work out very well. The Great Leap Forward was, not very well calculated economically. It had some disastrous consequences. And then, there was an attempt to overthrow Mao from within the party by a guy named Liu Shaoqi, who was more Soviet aligned. And so in response to Liu Shaoqi, you had the launching of the Cultural Revolution. And the idea was China was going to be, while the Soviet Union was compromising with the United States, China was going to be ultra communist during the Cultural Revolution. But by about 1968, 1969, it became clear that China was isolated in the world and they needed allies. And so starting in 1969, you started to see 1968 really with Czechoslovakia, when the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia in 1968 with the Prague Spring. China denounced it. And then in 1969 in Angola, there was an insurgency going on against Portuguese colonialism that was backed by the Soviet Union. China sent their military to basically work with the CIA and allies of the United States to work against that insurgency. And then Richard Nixon went to China, I believe 1972. Richard Nixon went to China, and by 1979, when diplomatic relations were established, China was on the side of the United States in the Cold War. In Afghanistan, they were aligned with the United States and the Mujahideen. In many parts of the world, they still maintained relationships with a lot of the communist countries around the world, but their foreign policy was denouncing what they called Soviet social imperialism, and that was the main thing. And in many African countries, you had a breakaway from the Communist Party that was aligned with China and getting weapons from the CIA that would fight the mainstream Communist Party that was aligned in many countries: Ethiopia, Angola, Tunisia. I mean, just many countries. Tanzania. You had communist factions kind of killing each other. There was the Kampuchea War of 1978, where Vietnam went to war with Pol Pot in Cambodia. We now know Pol Pot was being covertly supported by the United States, and then China invaded Vietnam to protect Cambodia, allegedly, because and saying that Vietnam was acting as an agent of the Soviet social imperialists. And Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger were sitting in the back and laughing about it, because instead of fighting the communists directly, like they had in Vietnam, what they could do is they could manipulate communists against each other, and arm one group to fight another group, and it was a very effective strategy. Part of it, was that that these groups that were being backed by the United States, like Pol Pot in Cambodia, they said you don't need development to have communism. Pol Pot said that Cambodia could have full communism on the basis of an agrarian economy. He called it agrarian socialism. He said industrialization was Western and bourgeois, started executing people for wearing glasses, et cetera. It was absolutely ridiculous. And all of this, the divisions in the communist movement, the confusion, and then in 1978, you had the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party and the Spanish Communist Party signing a declaration basically denouncing the Soviet Union and aligning with the United States. They called them Euro communists. Brzezinski praised them, and that was because a lot of them had these communist parties were being dominated by college professors who were getting grant money from the Ford Foundation and stuff, and really pushing what they call cultural Marxism, Antonio Gramsci, and all of this. And you had basically the communist movement being fractured, and it was all of that that ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet Union and the wave of neoliberalism that came in. And that was an effective strategy of U.S. imperialism for beating back, the Soviet Union and its allies. But it won't happen now, because the relationship between China and Russia at this point is not based on ideology. And China is not dependent on Russia. China is now the second largest economy in the world, thanks to Deng Xiaoping and the market reforms. They have built themselves up. So it's not like China is kind of begging Russia for aid, and then Russia is saying, okay, we're going to give you this aid, but we want you to take political leadership from us. It's not like that at all. China, you still have the Communist Party in power. And Russia, the communists, they're part of the government, but they're not the ruling party anymore. And Russia's economy is centered around exporting oil and gas. And China's economy is centered around industry, heavy industry, technology, fusion energy research. I mean, they've got the world's biggest power plants, the world's biggest hydroelectrical power plant. They got the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturer. They need lots and lots of oil and gas to keep their economy going. On the other hand, Russia needs to sell lots of oil and gas in order to maintain their state revenue. So they're almost a match made in heaven. And the USA puts sanctions on China and makes it harder for China to trade around the world, so they trade more with Russia. The USA puts sanctions on Russia, and they makes it harder for them to sell gas in Europe, et cetera. So they sell gas to China. And the two countries are economically joined together. So this idea that you're going to pull them apart is pretty ridiculous. But I will add, and I know I've gone on for some time here, I will add that I feel like there is a difference of short-term interests. Big oil hates Russia because it's a competitor, right? Big oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, they see Russia that sells gas and oil on the international markets. Until hydraulic fracking, Russia was the top oil and gas exporting country in the world. Now the United States is the top the top producer. Big oil sees Russia as the biggest threat to their domination of the global economy in the short term. Whereas industrial folks, I think the owner of Home Depot what's his name? Bernie Marcus, what's her name? Betsy DeVos, the head of the Department of Education. These folks see China as the biggest threat because China is an industrial producer that is producing phones and technology and competing with them. So in the short term, I think like military industrial complex and manufacturers see China as a bigger threat and a bigger competitor. Big oil sees Russia as a bigger competitor. At the end of the day, they both want to destroy both of them because they want the entire global economy to be centered around American banks and corporations. But the idea that you're going to pull the two of them apart is just ridiculous. That's my analysis of the whole situation. What do you think, Daniel?
I think it is ridiculous. I think that if you take a look at this factor that's developed in the past few weeks, India has refused to condemn the special military operation of Russia. And they are now making deals with Russia that go around the dollar system. It was back in the 1990s that Primakov was a leading diplomat from Russia. And he was at that time proposing a strategic triangle between Russia, India, and China, saying that this would be the basis for essentially Eurasian integration. And that's really what I think is the story here, is that there is a future that lies in the development of Eurasia with physical economic elements of development corridors. You've got the Belt and Road Initiative. It's being really disrupted by the war, but China's explicit outlook is that we need a shared community of destiny for mankind. That there is, they've actually on the Russia-Ukraine question, they have said our relationship with Russia is not an alliance. It's not directed at any third party, any third country, and we want what's best for Ukraine too. And what's best for both nations, of course, is a neutral, peaceful, denazified Ukraine, I can say, that would be a bridge between Russia and Europe, between Asia and Europe on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's the actual future that lies before Ukraine. And that's not just something that's in the interest of China, it's in the interest of every nation, because it's only on that type of physical economic development that you can see an improvement in living conditions. And it's the only alternative to the neoliberal system of financial usury and deindustrialization. So that's also what I see, is that it's known increasingly in Russia. There are problems. I just read a report from Sergei Glaziev, the economist, Russian economist who was an advisor to Putin for many years. We published his book. He had discussions with Lyndon LaRouche, in which he's emphasizing the central bank is doing some things that it shouldn't be doing in Russia. They're not actively doing the most important thing. I mentioned this in my comments at the CPI conference, which is to get loans into the economy for real productive development, lines of credit into the economy to take, what he's proposing is take, how these European companies have left behind stuff in Russia, saying take over those companies and then extend lines of credit to rapidly develop them and increase the production of those facilities and so forth, those productive capabilities. We need to get that moving very rapidly if we're going to come out of this crisis on top. But that tendency of having state-directed credit towards big infrastructure projects, towards increasing productive capabilities of all types, producing more and better goods, that's the future right now. And I think that's also, that's sort of the name of the game here, is that Russia and China know that, and increasingly many other countries across the world know that. And who's going to believe this neoliberal nonsense any longer?
Sure. State-directed credit, I will add, is one of the 4 planks of the Center for Political Innovation and our plan to rescue the economy, right? The idea is that money should be, lended and strategically done so for the benefit of the community, not just based on what some private bank thinks they can make money from it. If you have a national bank that is strategically assigning credit, you can plan out your economy around that, right? And I think that's a better way of doing things overall. And that's what they have in China. I mean, that there are private banks, but they're all kind of directed, and there are state banks that ultimately have the power, and there's a state central plan. And I know in Russia at this point, most of the revenue that comes in from the energy, revenue from oil and gas exports, goes into the public budget, and then is strategically assigned based on development. And that's how they've built. I mean, this amazing. I mean, there's been a huge boom in agriculture in Russia because at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, almost all the Soviet farms were privatized, sold off, and just shut down. Like it was like 80% of farms went bankrupt in Russia in the 90s. Well, in the last 5 or 6 years, Putin has made it a project to rebuild the agricultural system. And now Russia is the leading exporter of wheat in the world and the leading exporter of fertilizer. And that's one thing I know Brazil and other countries have raised. I mean, these sanctions will have an impact on countries around the world getting fertilizer. And that's been discussed very widely. Do you have an update on that and the impact of the sanctions on the food supply, et cetera?
Well, actually, there's some more stuff I wasn't able to get into my preparation for today, but I'm going to have to turn to. But I can say from what is the point is that if someone tells you that the food crisis is because of the Russian military action in Ukraine, which is what Macron is saying, for example,
right,
they are liars. This thing has been going on long before that. And it really has to do, importantly, with intentional policies of reducing agricultural output. There are these policies like 30 by 30 is the US policy, which is it's a Biden policy, a green policy that says we should take 30% of agricultural lands and set them aside to be non-productive by 2030.
Wow.
Yeah, I ran into some kind of degrowther on Twitter talking about this as well, where they say we should rewild agricultural areas.
Wow.
So there's been a big opposition to this over about the past 18 months, centered in the farm states. I guess
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my goodness. But go on. I have never heard of this. This is shocking to me. Wow.
You know how there have been all of these protests in India of the farmers, right?
Sure,
There have been other protests happening in Europe, and it includes opposing this kind of policy. If you say that we can only grow organic, for example, or not only, but like 25% is what they've said of European crops need to be organic. Well, organic yields are vastly lower than conventional yields. So what they're stipulating is the reduction of food output.
Wow.
And this is happening as part of basically a World Economic Forum policy, the Green New Deal policy. It's totally insane. What we should be looking at is the fact that if we don't, what we should be doing is immediately ramping up the production of artificial fertilizer. We should be ramping up, just to have a crash program to address the loss in the wheat production from Ukraine and Russia. Together, I think they represent 30% of the wheat production in the world. We should be looking at rapid efforts to address the approximately 48 million people in the world who are on the verge of starvation. And that it's not what people think when you open up the magazine. It's like, oh, well, what we need is money. Oh, we need money, right? We need money for the World Food Program. No, it's not. That's not it. They do need money. And it is ridiculous that they only need a little bit of money relative to everything else. But what we need is production. We need to increase the output in the world. So that's what I can say briefly. And I'll say, maybe to put it a little bit more clearly, if the Wall Street Journal published an article about 2-3 weeks ago in which they stated that if we see a continuation in fertilizer prices, which have tripled in a very short amount of time, all types of fertilizer, then it could be that we would lose a yield equivalent to 100 million people, to the food for 100 million people.
Wow.
So that's what I think we should be expecting on that front.
Well, I just had a chat like last week with Tara Reid.
The
journalist and sexual assault survivor who used to work for Joe Biden. And she said that in her experience working with these folks and working on Capitol Hill, that they see, this as, quote unquote, culling the herd. I mean, this fits in with their Malthusian agenda. They're trying to reduce the population. And it looks like messing with the food supply may be their strategy for doing it. Would you say that's what's going on here?
I have some good material for you if you give me a half a moment to go through it.
Sure.
Okay. 1979, Robert McNamara, president of the World Bank at the time, quote, "There are only two possible ways in which a world of 10 billion people can be averted. Either the current birth rates must come down more quickly, or the current death rates must go up. There are, of course, many ways in which the death rates can go up. In a thermonuclear age, war can accomplish it very quickly and decisively. Famine and disease are nature's ancient checks on population growth, and neither one has disappeared from the scene." I also have the opening of a congressional testimony about a congressional hearing, that is, about Global 2000, which is a U.S. State Department report that was delivered, I believe, in 1980.
Yeah, right. That's from the Carter administration, the Global 2000 report. I remember doing that, coming up in some research I was doing. Go on.
You can easily find this PDF. It's like so easy to get.
Yeah.
Here's what they say. According to our government study, this is what is in store for the planet Earth in the year 2000. 6.4 billion people will populate the Earth, an increase of 55%. Fully 77% of that population, 5 billion people, will live in the less developed countries. LDC. Already crowded LDC cities will become more crowded. And what will life be like for these teeming millions? Miserable. Most of the people in these LDC cities will live in uncontrolled settlements, slums, and shanty towns where sanitation, water supplies, and health care will be minimal at best. And of course, it goes on. Now, what's happened is that obviously China has proved that all of these predictions, besides the fact that you could have known then that they were wrong, as Lyndon LaRouche was fighting on, but China has substantively demonstrated that all of this is completely evil, genocidal nonsense, and that it is absolutely possible to continually raise the living standards of a population, and that we need increases in population in order to continue that process of the development of society. So I think you're right. If you look, I think Tara is right. In fact, I talked to her today. We had a wonderful chat.
Great.
And because I could keep citing. I'll mention one more thing, which is the infamous, I believe, 1983, maybe a little bit earlier, Henry Kissinger sanctioned U.S. State Department National Security Study Memo 200, in which he says directly, in which they say directly, not Kissinger himself, but he signed off on this, that we want to make food self-sufficiency lowered in the underdeveloped countries, because that'll make it easier for us to control them. We wouldn't want them to become independent. So I think it's been going on for 50, 60 years that these totally Malthusian policies have been implemented by the State Department. And if we don't change that, then surely they'll continue.
Wow. Well, I thought that your presentation at the conference, where you focused on the World Land Bridge, was great. And while you were up there speaking, I was thinking about, there's a friend of mine from Germany who told me about how I mentioned that I was talking with your organization and such. And he said that back in the 1980s, the LaRouche-aligned political party in Germany would have these election campaign posters about building the new Silk Road. And it would have a map of Eurasia, and it would have like high-speed railway trains, and people would laugh at them and say, "This is like crazy science fiction. Are they going to build spaceships?" And people just thought it was absolutely outrageous. And now it's happening. It's happening. The World Land Bridge is being built. The new Silk Road is happening, right? This is what One Belt, One Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union of Russia, this is what they're doing. He couldn't have been more right. And I believe you gave me a book that Lyndon LaRouche wrote called Earth's Next 50 Years. And I believe, if it's not the final chapter of that, is the Eurasian future. where he predicts, he predicts that Russia and China will emerge and that there will be development. So we talk about all this kind of, the Malthusian agenda of the rulers and such. But can you talk about the hope that we're seeing coming out of Eurasia?
You know what I want to focus on? There's a tendency that exists among people who see what you and I see, and what many of the people who are listening see, and many of the people at the conference see, which is the the Russia-China collaboration. Many people are actually looking at this, and rather than thinking about how the US can join this, what I see is that a lot of them are actually talking about like a new, when they use the words multipolar world, they seem to be fantasizing that there's going to be a future in which Russia and China are on one side of the world and the United States is on the other side of the world, crumbling, and that is somehow going to be sustainable. I want to say really clearly, Xi Jinping doesn't think that. Vladimir Putin doesn't think that. Unless the United States actually develops a government of action, to borrow your phrase, and changes its character and revives its best traditions, then there's not going to be any kind of tranquility in the world.
Yes, and that is, we had City Builders Day, March 15th. If you saw the stream we did where I talked about Julius Caesar, and I talk about that in our manual and such. And I've been returning to the work of Rosa Luxemburg lately, because that is something that we see where Rosa Luxemburg is saying that, socialism or barbarism. I mean, this path of imperialism and the imperialist model of development is going to lead to the end of Western civilization. The West is going to come apart, Western Europe and the United States. And if you're a good woke leftist, if you're part of the PSL with Brian Becker and all of them, you're supposed to go, yay, that's great. I hate this evil, racist, sexist society. Well, good for you. You get a cookie for being the most woke. But do you really want to live in the aftermath of the collapse of a civilization? And the instability that would flow out of that would not benefit, certainly wouldn't benefit us here. I mean, you want to live in the Mad Max movie, and it wouldn't benefit Russia and China to have all kinds of chaos and instability and drug gangs and terrorist groups flowing out of the carcass of the United States. The solution is not burn it down, tear it down. The solution is rescuing the United States and Western Europe with a rational economic model and dismantling. And that needs to be the message. And how on earth do you think average working class people are going to want to join your movement if the goal is burn it down, tear it down, make their lives worse, and get some kind of sexual cathartic explosion? I mean, this is particularly shocking to me, that I see from the left. And, the goal of socialism is to make people's lives better. And multipolarity doesn't mean the West just decays into nothing and Russia and China rule over the remnants and the ruins of what was once there. It means a whole new world is what it means. It means a relationship where we have some kind of government of action in the United States that is trading with Russia and China, trading with countries around the world on a win-win basis. Development, that's the answer. And I just think that just needs to be very, very apparent. And by the way, I do appreciate the super chats that are coming in. And if you have a question for Daniel or myself, just shoot us a super chat. We'll be happy to answer that. I know Daniel's got a lot more to say, and this is going to be one of probably a longer conversation than we normally have, but that's okay because we're hitting on some important points. So go ahead, Daniel.
I'm really glad that we're on the same page on this. And I knew we would be. But look, I want to be specific. You got people like Pepe Escobar, who people like because he has a lot of, up-to-date intelligence, and I give him credit on that, okay? But recently, he attacked the idea of a Treaty of Westphalia. And I want to address what this is, because I think that he's one of the people that we're talking about, even though he's not like in the Becker crowd. The Treaty of Westphalia is our reference point for what is needed today. There were 30 years, actually more like a century, of wars in Europe. Religious warfare, totally manipulated by empire, completely catastrophic. And in the 17th century, there were people who came together and they said, hold on, look at what's going on. The territory that is now Germany went from about 21 million people at the beginning of this warfare period to 14 million people. So they said, if we do not find a solution, then there is not going to be anyone to enjoy the conclusion of this war. There's no point in continuing the war. It's the most deleterious thing that we could possibly do. We have to find a way to work together. What do they focus on? They focused on annulling the worthless debts. They had a financial reorganization because they couldn't continue to pay debts that were based on something completely non-productive. They had an agreement to develop, for example, the waterways of present-day Germany with France, working together. This was actually the beginning of state-directed credit in Jean-Baptiste Colbert, one of the greatest economists in world history. But they got together and they said, forgive the other and then act on the interest of the other. Because if we don't do that, then there's nothing left. And that's really my view and the view of Helga Zepp-LaRouche today about the crisis with Russia in particular, and of course China. Namely, the president of Ukraine just lectured the entire US Congress about how we should start World War III.
Yeah.
Which of course would be the consequence of a no-fly zone. If we allow that to happen, no one is going to enjoy the victory. And so we better sit down at the table and figure out how to overcome the errors of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And this distinction that we are optimistic and, progressive, construction-oriented socialists, I think really separates the Center for Political Innovation from what we call the synthetic left, right? Which has just become obsessed with destruction and pessimism. And that's what a lot of people got from our conference. They got a glow, a feeling of hope and optimism that just came out of our meeting. A number of people told me that. We posted just the first video of the opening ceremony and my opening remarks, but Jackson's talk is probably going to be up in a matter of hours. Jackson Hinkle, Haas's remarks are coming up. Your remarks, Daniel, are going to be posted. There's plenty more. Peter Coffin and others, Mohammed and others. It's going to be great. The videos are going to be posted pretty soon. And you're going to see the atmosphere in the room. But I guess I'm going to ask you, Daniel, and then we'll follow up with some of the buzz about it on the internet afterwards. Yeah. But I'm going to ask you, what did you think of the conference? What was your perception?
So I emphasized this in my remarks and then in a tweet that I did later. But I have to tell you, I just loved speaking. Oh, let me respond to that briefly.
I'll write it down. We'll get to that at the end.
Okay, we'll get back.
Just keep talking. Yeah.
I just love talking to the CPI audience. I mean, when you look out when we looked out in the room in the auditorium that we were speaking in, you saw people who were emotionally, intellectually, really personally, deeply engaged in trying to figure out, what are we going to do? But they weren't approaching that from a feeling of, I don't know, like helplessness. They were approaching it from a sense that there is a way out and that there's something that I can do about that. And this is the quality that we want to develop all across the country. Everyone who thinks this way, we need to keep on drawing that out of people, encouraging it of them, and expecting people to have far more potential than you may have presumed. I mean, get out of the cynical assumption that your brother, your sister, and I mean your fellow American is not capable of dealing with the circumstances. I've often heard the assertion the United States is the most psyoped population in the world. Yeah, that's true. But if the way that people intone that, it's like saying there's nothing that you can do. There's no way that you can reach the people. Nonsense. There's a great opportunity that's before us, which was represented at the conference, to respond to the ideas of Russia and China, to respond to proposals from Russia and China.
Sure. I mean, just the atmosphere in the room. I mean, there was one woman there who got up towards the end of the meeting and said, "I'd like to become a John Brown volunteer. Can you make that happen?" And of course, we can't get into specifics there at the event, but that's how moved she was. And And people were people were just eating up what you had to say about the World Land Bridge, and people were loving the remarks about Nicaragua and their achievements in terms of universal,
Yes.
universal daycare and literacy and such. And that was really tremendous. And what's interesting, now I did want to mention security was quite heavy at the conference. You probably noticed that, Daniel. Security was very heavy, and we did remove some intended disruptors. There were some people who came who intended to give us a problem. And then there was one person who came to the event. Have you seen this video of the person who came to the event? We didn't kick them out. They looked a little weird, with their crazy makeup or whatever, but we let them there. They weren't causing a problem. And then they got on social media and had this meltdown afterwards about how we're nationalists and it was scary and all of this. And it was kind of a wake up call. And, for them, they were just in shock about our message. But I think it was a very, very successful event. But I wanted to ask you because I'm not ashamed to be associated with you guys. I think you guys are great. You guys have some of the best proposals around about fixing the economy. You expose the lies about Russia and China. And I got up and I said that we need to exonerate LaRouche. He was unfairly convicted, and I said that after you spoke, and I meant every word of it. We may come at things from an ideologically different background, but a lot of the goals for rescuing the country, for bringing about peace in the world, for securing economic development, a lot of our critique of the existing so-called synthetic left is very the same. So I was curious if you could just touch on, of course, I guess some people just discovered, it's like, come on, watch this YouTube channel. I have Daniel on all the time. Some people just discovered that I have a relationship with you all. And that's been oh my God. So one of the things that came up is they've dug up a picture of me. This is classic. They dug up a picture of me from 2013.
Yeah.
I went to a demonstration at the United Nations, welcome Putin the peacemaker, in response to Russia, sending its military to Syria to help protect the Syrian government, of me standing next to someone who's not associated with your group, hasn't been with your group for many years, a guy named Webster Tarpley, who called the demonstration, who I think I've met one time in my life, and it was at that rally. I've seen some of his other writings and stuff. But they said Caleb Maupin associates with this guy, Webster Tarpley, who's a LaRoucheist, and they wanted to imprison everyone with HIV. And so that's why I'm a bad person. So can you break that down for us? What are they talking about with this allegation that about locking up AIDS victims? What's the story there? Give us your side of the story.
Sure. Let me first just comment on what you're saying, that Tarpley has not been associated with the LaRouche movement for decades. And if you look at his website, he's a lunatic. I don't recommend it at all. He went completely bizarre.
Yeah, he's spreading Russiagate stuff now. Exactly. It's kind of hilarious. That picture from 2013, that was when he was saying positive things, but now he's promoting Russiagate and anti-Trump hysteria. I mean, he's completely opposite of you guys. So no association.
Exactly. Yeah, right. He's a non-entity. But so I knew stuff about Proposition 64, but I went and I researched it carefully when you raised this to me earlier today. And I want people to, if you're curious about the claim that LaRouche is anti-gay, or that Prop 64 was about throwing gay people in prison or something like that, go and read Prop 64. It's 3 paragraphs. Go and read it. Okay, because what is it about? Basically, I mean, let me pose it to you a particular way. How many people do you think have died of HIV?
I don't know.
39 million people.
Wow.
Gigantic problem. And in the really underdeveloped countries in this world, it's a huge crisis. It's still in the top 10 in terms of causes of death in certain countries. You're talking about like 80,000 people dying in certain African nations per year. And there are like over 1 million people who have HIV in the United States. Okay, so what am I trying to say? It's a deadly disease.
Sure.
And it has been an absolutely horrific problem for the world for 30 years. Now, what happened is that in the 1980s, when it became apparent that this was a problem, LaRouche said the following. He said, number one, we should treat this like any other major communicable disease. And that means, and you'll be interested to hear what he's proposing. He proposes that we should do contact tracing. We should quarantine people who are found to have it, and we should do mass testing, which, by the way, these are central planks of the Chinese government's zero COVID policy, right? And of course, any other legitimate policy in the world to try to eliminate COVID and any other major disease, especially one that's unknown and we don't, we're trying to figure something out about. Then if you read the pamphlet that was being distributed on the streets of California at the time to encourage that AIDS simply be, follow through with these policies, which were part of the California public health policies regarding major diseases, but somehow AIDS was being exempted from them because it was being politicized. LaRouche said, we need $2 billion a year for a crash program, an Apollo-style crash program to find a cure. That was one of the major things that he said should be done. And there were a couple of other things that are in there, which you can find through Wikipedia if you keep hunting, because, of course, they're mostly hidden a little bit. But he was saying that this is actually a consequence, and I think that this 39 million people death count is a good evidence that he was right, of the policies of Robert McNamara at the World Bank, of the IMF. Right?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because, so I guess the way, this policy, you're saying that it was contact tracing, widespread testing, funding to find a cure, and also, quarantining those who have it. At the time that this was the 1980s, I believe, right? Was this, what year was this? The 1980s, you're saying this happened?
Well, over the course of the mid 1980s.
Yeah. At that time, Cuba quarantined AIDS victims. And so if you're going to cancel me for standing next to Webster Tarpley, who advocated that, then you should cancel everybody who's ever worn a Che Guevara shirt or anyone who's, Fidel Castro support. I mean, that was the policy. And somebody that I'm very proud to have worked with, Leslie Feinberg. Do you know the name Leslie Feinberg, Daniel? Leslie Feinberg was the first transgender activist in U.S. history, the author of Stonewall Warriors, the author of Stone Butch Blues, and she was a member of the Workers' World Party, and she was a very prominent LGBT activist. She defended Cuba's right to quarantine AIDS victims, so much so that when the ACT UP people had a rally against the Cuban government, she went and disrupted it and got into fistfights with people. Because she could see that they were trying to use the AIDS movement to attack Cuba. And she took some very hard stances and got up at meetings and got booed and shouted down. And she said, no, Cuba, the science around AIDS was not clear at the time. And there were a lot, and it wasn't just Cuba, mind you. Cuba is a country that a lot of these woke people have some respect for. So I'm using this example. The Soviet Union, I believe, quarantined AIDS victims. Iraq did. And there were many countries in the developing world who didn't know what the science was. And they said, we don't want this disease to spread. Now we know that it's not transmitted by air, and we know the science of it. So now the idea of quarantining folks who have it is not something that I think most scientists would advocate. But at the time, people didn't know that. And the other thing is that there is in the developing world, and this is one of those issues where I don't know enough about it. And if I start to tell you what is actually true or whatever, I'm going to make a fool of myself because I'm not a biologist. But I do know that globally, and in China and in Africa and in India, there are many people that are critical of the prevailing narrative about HIV and AIDS in the media. And there's many people that have said that there's more to it, and that somehow the policies of economic development in Africa and in countries that don't have, modern water and sewage systems and such, that is related to the spread of AIDS. It's not simply, just that it's transmitted, that it's related to keeping countries in poverty and economic development. And that's an argument that you will hear made in China, that you will hear made in Africa, and you will not ever hear in the United States. And that many people feel that what the UN does, the effort to fight AIDS coming from these international institutions like the UN, the World Health Organization, it's not really, changing the situation. AIDS is still spreading. And that in a lot of ways, it's almost turned into an industry. They talk about the AIDS industry where, these celebrities are making videos and the problem isn't getting better. And I don't know enough about it. I'm not a scientist. I'm not here to tell you inaccurate information, but I know there's criticism in the scientific community of how the AIDS narrative is presented. And I really don't know enough about it. Do you know more about that than I do, Daniel?
I don't think I know specifically about the kind of subject that you're describing, but I can say the following. I remember the third issue that LaRouche was really promoting at the time was hospital construction. And right now, I mean, the
Yeah.
world, we need Sierra Leone to have enough hospitals that they can have, like 4 hospital beds per 1,000 people. We need that level, which was the FDR standard and the Hill-Burton standard all over the world, because COVID is not going to be the last major world pandemic. And what, not to mention the problem, I mean, I'm not even going to bring up the question of bioweapons and so forth that the Russians were talking about at the Security Council today, which is obviously a valid question. But if we're going to address the tendency for these diseases and so forth to spread all over the world, it means we have to, again, realize that the interests of the other are our own. If you want to stop COVID, for example, then you have to build up the health infrastructure, which means not just hospitals, not just training doctors, but you also have to have electricity. Hospitals are the most energy dense infrastructure that we have in some cases, or one of the most. We have to have water systems, and you have to have food. If you want people to be healthy, they have to have food. And so right now, there are two former U.S. Surgeons General, David Satcher and Jocelyn Elders, who have endorsed the Schiller Institute policy known as Operation Ibn Sina to develop advanced medical infrastructure in Afghanistan. And, that's the kind of thing I think will work.
Well, and a wild thing, right, is like we're talking about biolabs now and all of this. I know that, that in the 1980s, at least, the Workers' World Party that Leslie Feinberg was part of did believe that AIDS was somehow created by the government or something. Now, I don't know if they would say that now, but go read old issues of their paper. That was believed. And that was widely believed among HIV activists, the people that were protesting and wanting more money for AIDS research. A lot of them really did believe that somehow the government was to blame for AIDS. Now, I obviously have no evidence of that, and I'm not arguing that here. But I do believe in the Soviet Union. The Soviet government came forward and had some evidence to that effect or something like that. And in Iraq, I believe the government of Iraq and Syria made similar claims. And, at this point, I mean, when we see, and I just can't get over this, Daniel. Sorry to loop back around, but the fact that, Tulsi Gabbard is coming out and saying, this is a disaster. The U.S. government and the Pentagon have been building biolabs in Ukraine. And instead of saying, wow, thank you, Tulsi Gabbard, for pointing out that we really don't need to have another one of these pandemics, we're hearing, gee, they ought to lock her in jail for saying that. I mean, it's like, get your priority. I mean, what is the deal here? And I mean, how in the world can they say that building biolabs in Ukraine is a good policy? I mean, my goodness, the USA invaded Iraq saying that they had weapons of mass destruction when they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And it's starting to look, based on what Russia's saying, like Ukraine, right on Russia's border, a fanatical anti-Russian government full of Nazis and fascists, that they were potentially developing biological weapons to use against Russia. I mean, if that's not an alarm bell, if that's not something that should be on the front page of newspapers, I don't know what is. But then again, we know our mainstream media has a different agenda.
Can I bring up something that's tangential to, well, it's related to Tulsi. She was recently attacked in the press for receiving a $59 donation.
Oh, boy.
From Elena Branson, who's a friend of mine, who is now in Moscow because she is no longer apparently welcome in the United States. She ran the Russian Center New York, which is an organization founded to organize conferences to bring together U.S. and Russian, diplomats, but primarily business figures and so forth, to discuss how to work together for win-win cooperation. And for that, she has been labeled a spy and pursued for failing to register through FARA and so forth, much like Butna. It's so infuriating because this woman was one of the major people actually trying to solve the crisis, and and very much as a Russian American. Her family is in America, or
Yeah,
at
she's a
least
U.S.
when I
citizen.
knew her.
She's a U.S. citizen. She's got dual
Exactly.
citizenship.
Exactly.
I mean, right. And I mean, it's like, oh boy, I mean, taking Tulsi could have taken 4 of her staffers to McDonald's and that would have just changed everything. I mean, $59 for goodness sake.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, just another brief point on it is that the other thing that Elena Branson was involved in is the Russian American Compatriot Organization. I forget, they changed the name a couple of times. I forget what they called it, but which is an umbrella organization of Russian Americans in the United States that was founded to actually have people to have some cultural unity, some sense of of being both Russian and American, right? It's a Russian American organization. I was at one of several of their major events. They were part of organizing the Immortal Regiment marches in New
yeah,
York City.
I saw you at that march. I used to go to that every year as well. Yeah, but go on, continue.
Well, you know what? I was at the most recent one, which was virtual because of COVID. And think about what they're doing. The main thing they're doing is talking about the sacrifice at these particular events, the sacrifice of the Russian people against fascism, and how Americans. These are the main Americans who are actually celebrating the U.S.-Russian joint defeat of Nazism, and that is what they say is the activity of a Russian spy. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's in this atmosphere of anti-Russian hysteria. That brought back a memory. I'll just share this, and then we'll get to the super chats, and then I think we'll be done. So if anyone has a super chat, now would be the time. If you have any more questions for Daniel or I, now would be the time to get it. But when you talk about, I think at one point, I think that organization that you mentioned, I think it was called Friends of the Soviet Union, if I'm not mistaken. There was a very elderly, I mean, in her 80s, communist activist in Cleveland who died. And I had the honor really of visiting her, going to her memorial service. Her family were from Lebanon. They were Lebanese Christians. They'd immigrated to the United States in the 1930s. And at the memorial, I mean, it's the memorial meeting, and it's her family are there, and they're kind of a slideshow about her, and they're going from picture. They said she was always very outspoken for peace. Here she is marching for nuclear disarmament. Click. Here she is marching against the Vietnam War. Click. Oh, and she was, very outspoken for peace. Here she is. And they showed a picture of her with a huge hammer and sickle flag at Friends of the Soviet Union. It's like she wanted peace, and she wanted peace. And it's like, I think it was a little bit more than a peace activist. I think grandma was a communist, but they didn't want to say that at the memorial. The family probably wasn't all on board with that. But I thought it was very adorable to be there in the room with all the aunts and uncles and all of that, as they were showing that grandma marched for peace and all that. It was very, very
great.
Yeah. But anyway, let's get to the super chat question here we got. So they want Daniel's perspective on Moon of Alabama and the Sacker. Are these blogs good, or are they fake anti-imperialists? Do you know these websites?
I don't know enough about either to really say anything, except to say that I have read Moon of Alabama, and they seem to have reasonable analysis. But I can say more strongly that I do not see solution concepts coming from people who present themselves as geopolitical analysts. And this is kind of what I'm saying about Pepe Escobar. I don't see, if your interest is like as a news hound figuring out what's going on, what's going to happen next, then I encourage you to reconsider your priorities and try to do something about the crisis.
Okay. And the next question someone asked, it was about a campaign, and we can't get into that on here because we don't campaign for anybody. The Center for Political Innovation is not politically aligned. So I know that you are involved with various candidates, and if people want to get involved with the candidates you're involved with, then they should talk to you about that. But we unfortunately can't get into that on here. But I guess, do you want to make any final remarks, Daniel, before we show our closing trailer and wrap up?
Yes. Well, once again, thank you. And thank you for organizing the conference. Thank you for organizing the Center for Political Innovation. I think it's clearly a bright light for Americans and also for people around the world who are they're wondering, are there any sane Americans left? And then they can look to what you're doing and what people like-minded are doing, and they can say, okay, take a breath and let's hope for something.
Well, let me just add on what you said, Daniel, and I thank you, and I thank you for flying all the way out to Texas to give remarks. I know your kids missed you back in Jersey and your and such, and bringing a few of your friends to town. It was really excellent. And one thing that I've been reflecting on is all over the world, the United States has had a policy of going to countries and kind of inciting the population against each other, like Ukraine, for example. You got Russian-speaking people, you got people in the eastern regions. They built these fanatical organizations of Nazis to fight against the Russian-speaking people. And it seems like this policy of going around the world and cultivating these extremist groups, these counter gangs, has come home. And that's what they've got in store for the United States. Polarization, red states versus blue states, Proud Boys versus Antifa, Patriot Prayer versus Black Lives Matter, and they want us fighting each other in the streets and shooting at each other as the whole country gets poorer. And that is not the mission of the Center for Political Innovation, and that should not be the mission of any genuine socialist. The goal should be to bring the people of the country together around a program to make everyone's lives better. And I don't know what your reaction was, Daniel, but I've been heard from many people that one of the most beautiful moments of the conference was when I referenced in my closing remarks Lily Goldklang and Keaton Mansfield. And Lily Goldklang is, she's from the suburbs of Atlanta. She's transgender. She's Jewish. Keaton Mansfield is Roman Catholic. He's a conservative farm boy from Illinois, but they're both in the same organization, working around the same goals. They may not agree about abortion and gay marriage or whatever, but they agree with the program for rescuing the country. They agree with opposing imperialism. And, when I made those remarks and the two of them actually, they hugged, and I said afterwards, did you guys plan that? And they said, no, that was kind of spontaneous. So, it was a very sweet moment. But I mean, do you think that there is hope for making this country come together and not falling into the plans for balkanization and polarization of the population? Do you think that we can unify people in red states and blue states, conservatives and liberals, people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds? Do you think we can win them together on a program like this? I mean, do you think that that's a hopeful project?
Yes, I do. I appreciate the way that you started that remark, because I think it is up to the people who are listening. It's up to the people who across the country are thinking about what they can do, because how is the U.S. population going to respond the day that the stock market blows out completely? How are they going to respond? Is it going to be Proud Boys in the streets brawling with, I don't know, BLM, Antifa, whatever? Is that what it's going to be? What's it going to be like when there's people go to the ATM and they can't get the money out? I think that the response of the American population to the worsening of this crisis, whatever form it takes, whatever it develops, will be determined by the actions of people like Lily and Keaton, like ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean everyone listening to this and participating, thinking about these questions. So it's really up to us to build that. And I do believe that your program, which of course has a significant overlap relationship to the LaRouche policy, I think that if we continue to develop, discuss, enrich, put flesh and bone on these ideas, then I agree with you. This gives people a vision that unifies, because it's about being human. It's about wanting to reproduce society at a greater and greater level. It's about wanting a better, physical condition for the population, cultural condition for your children. And that's the most unifying thing that exists. So I am hopeful.
Well, very good. Well, on that note, I'll bring up the closing video, and we'll be out.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, Revolution is the main trend in the world today.